most of you know me as a politician in this country, but in reality, I'm an economist. Nobody's perfect, right? So we did have a bad few years experience as well. So I want to share with you how informality and insecurity influence the real estate market, influence our prosperity, influence much more than real estate market, frankly. But the real estate is really our home. It's land and labor. So the first two factors of production in economics that we learn, anybody who has taken one class of economics, land and labor, tamarulla, puele y kiria prin, agricultural land and labor, the person who works on it, and then we turn it into capital, biomechanike zones or industrial zones and so on. So informality is touching mainly our home assets, right? However, today's prominent global issues that concern world leaders, decision makers around the world are artificial intelligence, climate change, crisis in democracy. Everybody talks about the fact that we have so many elections this year, and inflation. These are the topics that are in every agenda. They were at the World Economic Forum in Davos, the IMF meetings, the spring meetings in April. They continue. These are the ones. But then most countries' leaders, when they go to these meetings, they talk about these very important issues, but then they come back to their home, they struggle with different basic issues that actually stifle their economy, and they get under pressure because they have to handle those issues to improve the citizenry and the wellness of their own people in their own country. And what are these issues? Inequality, alarmingly thinning middle class. We have continuous flows of refugees and immigrants everywhere, and rising sovereign debt, which we don't want to talk about because it's very scary, and housing shortage. You know, housing shortages and affordable housing have been topics that have only been discussed for the third world. And now we have them everywhere. And you know what is really interesting is that in this whole picture, the fundamental challenge, which is almost always ignored, is not touched. And that fundamental challenge is informality. Informality is a condition of social insecurity. It seems invisible. I'm sure all of you are questioning, what is she talking about? It's invisible, it's untouchable, yeah? And it's often confused with poverty, with tax evasion, and with illegality, αυθαιρεσίες. But it is not. Informality is just a result of, in some countries, totally undocumented or badly documented assets of a human, the identity card of a human, and of his home or her home or their home. And it is that type of insecurity that increases vulnerability, risk, but most importantly, it erodes trust. So if I'll tell you that 2 out of 3 people in the world live in this insecure ecosystem, you won't believe me. But 70% of the world's population is informal, in some layer, some level. The rights are not universal. Their contracts, their property rights, their identities, although they are accepted, they're not accepted by the government effectively as they are. Something always has to be changed. Something has to be fiddled with. And this creates an inability to prove critical things. Prove who we are, to prove what we own and prove what we are owned. So if I were to express, make you feel what is informality, the best way to explain it is to say it's a messy situation. It's not attractive, you know. When countries have informality, investors are not attracted, no matter what the government does. Foreign direct investment, reduction of taxes, zones, industrial this, whatever. It happens, you have a little bit of traction and it's not sustainable. Because we get, it's a non-attractive, stressful space that gets you out of normalcy and out of equilibrium. And then we call it, it's a Filipino reality. If you're in the Philippines, well, this is the reality of our country. Or in Greece, we would say, αυτή είναι η ελληνική πραγματικότητα. Or if you go to Bolivia, they tell you, well, this is the Bolivian reality. Why? Because you're out of the equilibrium, out of normalcy, and you cannot have a predictable long-term behavior and long-term trend. That's a problem. So the important element is to explain that informality is in parallel, it's a parallel reality of the formal world. And it's not a technicality, nor is a theory. Actually, there is no theory about it. It's corrosive and it is contagious. And it pulls all the prosperity that we're working on. It's erosive. So if we want to protect our prosperity that we have worked for, and if we want to give humans a life of dignity, the very important thing is to accept that we have to change the rules, and it is difficult. But you know what? There is no choice. Otherwise, you're going to stay informal. And worse. And it is possible. And I'm telling you it's possible because I have seen it in the last 30-some years that I'm working in over 40 countries. It has been possible. And we have to do it. You know, I created a methodology called reality check analysis. It is a methodology that it is built outside the economic traditional development paradigm. Anyone knows the Bretton Woods Agreement. Outside that treaty. Why? Because in my experience, I understood that in the existing development paradigm, the tools we are having to deal with actually sometimes perpetuate the problem. Most of the time perpetuate the problem. And they're not friendly to change, and they're not friendly to disruption, and they're not friendly to innovation. Okay, so RCA, what it does, it analyzes all the confusion that I explained to you, and analyzes what is that creates the break of the normalcy throughout the history. It doesn't look at 2024, but tries to understand why we got there. But in order to have an RCA reaction, you need to have a visionary leader and an unstoppable leader. You need to have discipline, curiosity, common sense. So I'm going to give you two examples. In one of the countries I was working, I found a lady that had a 90 square meters home, plot, and a home on it, with a little yard around. A little shanty, right? I valued the place $12. The whole thing, $12. It would take her 30 years to transfer that little piece of land and home to her children. 30 years. She needed 9 different certifications formal government certifications to prove that she exists, that she's a citizen of her country. Okay? So obviously, all of her existence is informal because she doesn't have all 9 certifications. And she was waiting for 30 years to do the transfer to her kids, right? But that is an extreme, if you like, developing country environment. But let's go to the European Union, to the Eurozone. I have another example of a lady in a Eurozone country. I'm not going to tell you the country. It's not too far away from us. She's 70-something. She speaks 3 languages. She's well-educated. She doesn't have 9 identity cards to prove who she is. She has 1. She even has a passport. She travels, okay? She has a pride about who she is. Yet, she had to spend 11 long years in the court system of her country to prove that the house that she owns and she lives in, that was transferred formally by her grandfather and her father to herself, belongs to her. 11 years. So for these 11 years, this asset was outside of the market. So if you have a multiplicity of these type of cases in that specific country, you're completely out of equilibrium, no matter how many REITs you create. It's very hard to create a relative pricing. With RCA, we managed to change this, and just the lady, because we've worked in the European Union, not in the Eurozone. In the country I was telling you about, where the lady had to wait 30 years, we fixed it in about 1.5 years. The World Bank, it was taking forever to want to accept to do this, so we did it outside the World Bank's role. And in 1.5 years, she built her home to a better 3-story building in a whole context, or in a whole country. That's not just herself. Do you know how much she sold the first floor of her house? $500,000. $12, $500,000. This is not returns anymore. This is, you're moving stratospherically. You just evolve to a complete different space. And that was just giving security. That's it. Simplifying the system, reducing transaction cost, eliminating the 30-year wait to 1-hour wait. Not at all based on digitization. That was done much later. And that resulted to these extraordinary changes that was, I would call them explosive results. So, visionary leadership is very important. Appetite for reform, it's even more important. Because you may have a prime minister or a president that tells you, I'm really willing to do it. But if the secretary of that same person doesn't even know what the heck he's talking about, and there are no advisors or people in the government system that are eager to do the change, this is never going to go anywhere. You have to be hungry to do it. Because the frictions, the daily frictions in your trial to do these changes are many. So you really have to have that hunger.